My mother handed me a glass of champagne and told me to smile, because in about 10 minutes I was going to hear the best news of my life. That's the exact phrase she used. The best news of my life. I remember thinking that was a strange thing to promise someone because in my experience, whenever a person tells you in advance how you're supposed to feel, it's because they already know you won't feel that way on your own. We were at my parents' house in Millbrook, the kind of small Ohio town where everyone still uses the word homestead without irony, and the whole family had gathered for what I'd been told was an early celebration of my grandmother's birthday. She would have been 81 that week. She'd been dead for 2 years, but my mother liked to keep the tradition of a birthday dinner anyway, and honestly, I never minded. It gave us a reason to sit around a table and pretend we were the kind of family that still did that. My brother Derek stood up before dessert, tapped his fork against his glass like he was about to propose a toast, and said, "We sold the lake house." For a second, I thought I'd misheard him. Then I looked at my father, who was smiling the way he smiles when he's proud of himself, and I understood I hadn't misheard anything at all. The lake house. My grandmother's lake house. The one she'd specifically, deliberately, in writing left to me. "Sold it to the Hendersons," Derek said, grinning like he'd just won something. "Cash offer, closed Tuesday. $210,000. Dad's paying off my truck, and the rest is going toward Mom's knee surgery. Isn't that great?" Everyone at the table was nodding. My Aunt Carol was already crying happy tears. My mother was watching me with an expression I'd seen my whole life. The one that says, "React correctly, or you'll ruin this for everyone."
Here's the thing about my job.
I've spent 11 years as a title examiner. It is, by most standards, one of the most boring professions a person can have. I sit in an office, and I trace the ownership history of pieces of land back through decades of deeds, liens, easements, and probate filings until I can say with total legal certainty who actually owns a piece of property and whether the person trying to sell it has the right to do that at all. It's paperwork. It's dry. Nobody has ever been impressed at a dinner party when I explain what I do. But it means I notice things other people don't. I notice signatures. I notice notary stamps. I notice the difference between a deed that was properly recorded and one that was quietly filed and forgotten. And I noticed, sitting at that table with a champagne glass sweating in my hand, that there was no possible way my parents had just sold that house. Because 2 years earlier, after my grandmother's funeral, I had walked into the Warren County Recorder's office myself and filed the deed that made me the legal owner of that property. Quietly, without telling anyone. Because I didn't want to fight, and because I'd learned by then that the less my family knew about what belonged to me, the safer it was. "That's not possible," I said. My father laughed like I'd made a joke. "It's already done, Simon. Don't be difficult." I want you to sit with that phrase for a second because it tells you almost everything you need to know about the next 8 months of my life. Don't be difficult. Not, "You're mistaken." Not, "Let me explain." Don't be difficult, as if the problem in that room was going to be my reaction, and not the fact that my family had apparently forged a signature to sell a house that hadn't been theirs to sell in over 2 years. I set my glass down very carefully, because I have a rule about not making decisions while I'm angry, and I said, "Who signed the deed transferring the property out of my name?" The table went quiet the way a room goes quiet right before a fire alarm goes off. You can feel it coming before you hear it. My mother's face changed first. Just slightly. Just enough. "What do you mean, out of your name?" she said. And that was the moment I understood this wasn't going to be a misunderstanding I could clear up over pie. This was going to be a war, and I was the only person at that table who had, sitting in a fireproof lockbox 40 minutes away, the one piece of paper that could end it. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me explain how we got here. I grew up the second of 3 kids in a family that ran on a very specific kind of math. My older sister Renee left for Chicago at 18 and mostly stayed gone, which the family treated as a personality trait rather than a survival strategy. My younger brother Derek was the baby, the golden one, the kid whose failures always seemed to happen to him rather than because of him. And I was the middle, the fixer, the one who showed up. If you've ever been the person everyone calls when something goes wrong, you already know what that role does to you. You stop being a person with your own problems and you start being a resource, a utility, something the family keeps around because it's useful, The way you keep a good flashlight in a drawer, you don't think about it until the power goes out, and then suddenly you're the most important thing in the house. I want to be fair to my parents here because this story isn't going to work if you think of them as monsters from the very beginning. My father, Walter, spent 31 years running a small hardware store before it finally closed, and he genuinely believed that a man's worth was measured by whether his family had food and a roof. Full stop. No further philosophy required. My mother, Diane, had been a nurse for most of her life. The kind of nurse who could hold a dying stranger's hand for an hour and then go home and forget to ask her own son how his week was going, because her capacity for care had a ceiling and she'd already spent it on people who weren't us. They loved us. I believe that. But love in that house was distributed like a limited resource, and somewhere along the way I decided that the way to guarantee my share of it was to make myself indispensable. I became a title examiner almost by accident. In college, I took one real estate law course to fill a requirement, and something about it clicked in a way nothing else had. I liked the idea that ownership wasn't a feeling. It was a fact, provable, traceable, written down in ink that didn't care how anyone felt about it. In a family where the truth constantly seemed to bend to whoever was speaking the loudest, I found something enormous in the idea of a document that simply could not be argued with. By the time I was 34, I'd built a quiet, stable life. A condo 40 minutes from my parents. A decent job at a title insurance company. A habit of showing up whenever the family needed something. Co-signing Derek's first apartment lease when he was 22. Driving 4 hours to help my parents move a refrigerator. Spending 3 consecutive Christmases handling the boring adult stuff, as my mother called it, so everyone else could enjoy the holiday. And every single time I told myself the same thing. I thought being useful meant being loved. I didn't examine that belief for years, the same way you don't examine a load-bearing wall until the house starts to crack. The lake house came into the picture the way most inheritances do, quietly and then all at once. My grandmother, Eleanor, was my father's mother, and she was the only adult in my childhood who ever made me feel like the things I noticed mattered. She used to sit with me on the dock of that little house on Coldwater Lake and ask me to tell her what I saw. Not what I felt. What I saw. The exact color of the water at 7 in the morning versus 7 at night. Which dock boards were starting to rot. Whether the neighbor's boat had been moved. You've got an examiner's eyes, Simon. She told me once, when I was maybe 11. Most people look at the world and see a story. You look at it and see evidence. Don't ever let anyone talk you out of that. She left me that house in her will. Not the family. Me specifically, by name, with a note attached that I still have in her handwriting that said, "This one's yours because you were the one who actually looked." My father was furious when the will was read. Not because he needed the house, he didn't, not really, but because it broke the family's unspoken hierarchy, the one where Derek got the emotional inheritance of being the favorite, and I got the functional inheritance of being the one who handled things, and neither of us was supposed to end up with an actual asset that made either role official. She wasn't thinking clearly at the end. My father said, more than once, in the months after the funeral, that house should be split 3 ways. Renee, Derek, and you. That's what's fair. I understood even then that fair in my family had a very specific and flexible definition. Fair meant whatever kept the peace. Fair meant whatever cost me the least amount of complaint from everyone else. I'd been the family's version of fair my whole life, and I was tired of it. So I didn't argue. I didn't lecture my father on estate law, even though I could have in exhaustive detail. I simply drove to the Warren County Recorder's office one Tuesday afternoon, filed the deed transferring the property fully and legally into my name, and told absolutely no one. That's the belief I want you to hold on to, because it's going to matter later. I thought if I stayed quiet about what was mine, I could avoid a fight. I thought silence was the same thing as peace. It took me a long time to understand that silence, in a family like mine, isn't peace at all. It's just a delay on a bill that's still coming due. For 2 years, nothing happened. I paid the property taxes myself, quietly, out of an account my family didn't know existed. I drove out to the lake house twice a year to check the roof and clear the gutters and make sure the pipes hadn't frozen. I never told anyone I owned it outright, and my family, as far as I could tell, simply assumed the house was still floating in some unresolved family limbo, the kind of asset nobody quite deals with because dealing with it would require an uncomfortable conversation. I should have known that assumption wouldn't last. My family doesn't do unresolved. My family resolves things by deciding unilaterally what's convenient and then presenting that decision to everyone else as an already settled fact. The first sign something was wrong came about 4 months before that dinner, when my mother called me on a Sunday and asked, very casually, whether I still had the paperwork on Grandma's place. What kind of paperwork? I asked. Oh,
The deed.
the insurance stuff. Your father wants to get it appraised. I told her I'd look into it, which was true, and I did not mention that I already had every piece of paperwork on that house sitting in a lockbox because I'd owned it for 2 years and had personally handled every document that ever touched it. I told myself I was being cautious. Looking back, I think I already knew, on some level I hadn't fully admitted to myself, that something was coming. The second sign came 6 weeks later, when Derek posted a photo on social media standing on the lake house dock with the caption, "Big things coming for this place, eyes." I called him and asked what that meant. "Nothing, man, just being dramatic," he said, in the breezy way Derek said almost everything, like the world was a mildly amusing show he was watching rather than a place where his choices had consequences for other people. "Dad's got some ideas about the property. You know how he is." I did know how he was. What I didn't know yet was how far he'd already gone. Here's what I found out later, piece by piece. The way you find out anything in a family that specializes in half-truths, not all at once, but in fragments, each one worse than the last. My father had been telling people for the better part of a year that the lake house was part of the family estate and that he was handling the sale. He'd contacted a local real estate agent, a woman named Patty Sorrell who'd sold houses in that lake community for 20 years and who, I'd later learn, had absolutely no reason to doubt that the man calling himself the property owner's father was telling the truth. My father told her he had power of attorney over the estate. He did not. My grandmother's estate had been closed for 2 years. There was no estate left to have power of attorney over. There was just a house, and it belonged to me. But my father needed money. That part, at least, turned out to be true, and it's the part of the story where I have to be honest about something uncomfortable. My father's need wasn't manufactured. Derek had gotten himself into real trouble. A truck loan he couldn't cover after losing a job. A credit card debt from a relationship that had ended badly. 6 months of a lifestyle he couldn't afford maintained on a credit line that had finally maxed out. And my mother genuinely did need knee surgery, a real procedure, with real pain behind it, that their insurance only partially covered. I understood the need. I have never, in the entire time since, denied that the need was real. What I could not accept, then or now, was the solution my father chose, which was to take something that was mine, without asking, and sell it to strangers to solve a problem I hadn't caused and hadn't been invited to help solve honestly.
If he'd called me.
If he'd simply called me and said, "Simon, I know that house is legally yours, and I'm asking you for help. I want you to know right now, before this story goes any further, that I would have said yes. I would have found a way. That's who I'd always been for this family. That's the tragedy sitting underneath everything that happened next. He didn't need to steal from me. He only needed to ask. But asking would have meant admitting the house wasn't his to offer. And admitting that would have meant confronting the fact that, 2 years earlier, I'd quietly done something that changed the entire architecture of our family without telling anyone. I'd stopped being available for the taking. So instead, he forged my signature on a quitclaim deed, had it notarized by a friend of his who ran a small check cashing and notary shop out on Route 9, and used that fraudulent document to convince Patty Sorrell, and eventually the Hendersons, the buyers, that he had legal authority to sell a house that had not belonged to him in over 2 years. I didn't know any of that yet, sitting at that dinner table with a champagne glass in my hand. All I knew, in that moment, was that my family had just announced the sale of my house, and that whatever paper they were using to justify it, it wasn't a paper I had signed. But I didn't know that was only the beginning. "What do you mean, out of your name?" my mother said again, and I watched her hand tighten around her napkin. "I mean, I said, keeping my voice level because I have learned over many years that the person who stays calm in a room like that one holds all the power, even when it doesn't feel that way, that I've owned that house outright since about 6 weeks after Grandma's funeral. I filed the deed myself. It's been in my name for 2 years. So, I need someone to explain to me who signed the paperwork that just sold it. Derek's grin faded slower than it should have, which told me he genuinely hadn't known, or hadn't let himself know, the specifics of how the sale had actually gotten done. My Aunt Carol looked between my parents with a particular panic of a woman realizing she'd celebrated something she didn't fully understand. And my father did something I will remember for the rest of my life. He looked directly at me, and instead of shock or guilt or even anger, his face settled into a kind of tired, put-upon patience, the exact expression he used to make when I was a teenager asking too many questions about a decision he'd already made. "Simon," he said, "that house was never supposed to be just yours. Your grandmother wasn't in her right mind at the end, and everybody at this table knows it. I did what needed to be done for this family. I'm not going to apologize for taking care of your mother and your brother." "Who signed it, Dad?" He didn't answer right away, and in the silence, my mother did something that told me everything. She reached over and put her hand on his arm, not in comfort, but in warning, the universal gesture of a spouse trying to stop a partner from saying something in front of witnesses. "It was handled," my father finally said. "The house is sold. It's done. I don't see why we need to have this conversation at dinner." "Because I have never signed a deed transferring that property to anyone," I said. "Which means whoever put my name on that document forged it, which is a felony. So I'm going to ask one more time, and then I'm going to stop asking and start finding out on my own, which you should know by now I'm very good at. Who signed it?" The table sat in a silence, so complete I could hear the refrigerator humming in the next room. And then my niece, Derek's daughter, Mia, 12 years old, sitting at the far end of the table where the kids always sat, said, quietly, in the flat, honest way that only children who haven't yet learned to protect adults from consequences can manage, "Grandpa signed Uncle Simon's name. I saw him practicing it on the notepad by the phone. He was doing it over and over until it looked right. I want you to imagine what it's like to have the worst thing you suspected about your own father confirmed by a 6th grader at a dinner table, over pie that nobody was going to finish eating." My father's face went a color I'd never seen it go before. My mother told Mia to go to her room, which was unfair because Mia hadn't done anything except tell the truth in a house that had apparently forgotten how. I stood up. I did not raise my voice. I have found, over the years, that raising your voice in a moment like that only gives everyone else permission to make the conversation about your tone instead of about what actually happened, and I was not going to let that happen to me. I put my napkin on the table, folded once, the way my grandmother always did, and I said, "I'm going to need everyone to understand something. That house has been legally mine since before any of you knew it. My father just committed forgery to sell it out from under me, and I intend to get it back." Then I left. I didn't slam the door. I didn't cry in the car, not right away. I drove 40 minutes home in a silence so total it felt like the inside of a held breath, and it wasn't until I got to my own driveway, sitting there with the engine off, that the full weight of it finally hit me, and I put my head against the steering wheel and let myself feel, for maybe 90 seconds, exactly how much it hurt to learn that my own father had looked at something that belonged to me and decided it was easier to steal it than to ask. 90 seconds. That's all I gave it. Then I went inside, opened my fireproof lockbox, and pulled out the one document that was about to become the most important piece of paper in my entire family's history. I should tell you what was actually in that lockbox, because it matters. There was the original recorded deed, transferring the property from my grandmother's estate into my name, stamped and certified by the Warren County Recorder's Office, dated a little over 2 years before that dinner. There was the title insurance policy I'd taken out on the property myself, because old habits die hard, and a title examiner who doesn't insure his own title is a walking joke in my profession. There was a folder of tax receipts showing I'd personally paid every dollar of property tax on that house for 2 years running, receipts with my name and my bank account attached to every single one. And there was my grandmother's handwritten note. This one's yours because you were the one who actually looked, which had no legal weight at all, but which I kept in that lockbox anyway, because some things you protect for reasons that have nothing to do with the law. Against all of that sat one piece of paper my father had produced, a quitclaim deed with a signature that was, to my professional eye, obviously not mine, too careful, too deliberate, the kind of signature you get when someone is copying a shape rather than writing their own name. Notarized by a man named Kurt Halloran, who ran that check-cashing shop on Route 9, and who I would later learn had notarized documents for my father twice before, for two much smaller, much less consequential transactions, and had apparently never once asked to see the actual person whose name was on the paper. I want to pause here and tell you something about the world I work in, because I think it surprises people. Fraudulent deeds happen more often than you'd think, and most of them get caught, eventually precisely because paper doesn't forget. Every document leaves a trail. Every notary stamp has a number, a jurisdiction, a registration that can be checked. Every recorder's office keeps records going back generations. My family had just tried to erase a legal fact using a lie, and lies, in my line of work, are the single easiest thing in the world to unmake, because all you have to do is put the truth next to them and watch which one survives contact with the courthouse. That's the promise I want to make you, sitting there with me at that dinner table in that silence, in that 90 seconds in my car. The consequences of what my family had done were about to become so much larger than anyone at that table understood. And I was the only person alive who had the paperwork to make it happen. The next morning, I called the Warren County Recorder's office and requested a certified copy of whatever new deed had been filed on the lake house. It took 3 days to arrive, and when it did, I sat at my kitchen table and read it the way I read every document that crosses my desk at work, slowly, methodically, looking for the small inconsistencies that most people never notice because most people have never had to. The forged deed listed my father as attorney-in-fact for the estate of Eleanor R. Whitfield, acting on my behalf under power of attorney dated 11 years earlier, a real document. As it turned out, one my grandmother had actually signed back when my father helped manage some of her affairs during a health scare. The problem, the enormous case-ending problem, was that a power of attorney dies with the person who granted it. My grandmother had been dead for 2 years. That power of attorney had expired the moment she did. My father hadn't just forged my signature. He'd also relied on a legal instrument that had been void for 2 years, either because he genuinely didn't understand that, which I doubted, or because he was counting on the fact that nobody involved in the transaction would think to check. Nobody had checked. Not the real estate agent. Not the title company that had, embarrassingly, issued a title policy on a property with a broken chain of title, a mistake that, in my professional opinion, should never have happened, and one I intended to make sure got corrected loudly. Not the buyers, the Hendersons, who I felt genuinely sorry for, because as far as I could tell they were simply a retired couple from Cincinnati who'd wanted a lake house for their grandkids and had no idea they'd just paid $210,000 for a property that legally could not be sold to them. I photographed every page. I built a timeline. I pulled the tax records, the insurance records, the original recorded deed, side by side with the forged one, and I laid them out on my kitchen table like a courtroom exhibit, because in my head, that's exactly what they were about to become. And then my mother called. "Your father wants to talk," she said, before I'd even said hello. "He wants to fix this like a family, not like some kind of legal case." "I'd love to hear how he plans to fix it," I said. "He's going to pay you back your share." "That's fair, isn't it? We split the money 3 ways instead of using it all for Derek's truck and my knee. You get $70,000. That's more than fair, Simon." I sat with that for a moment because I think it's important to understand exactly how my family's math worked. They weren't offering to undo the fraud. They weren't offering to tell the Hendersons the truth, or to admit to a felony, or even to acknowledge that the house had never belonged to any of them to sell in the first place. They were offering me 1/3 of the profit from a crime, as though the crime were a shared family investment gone slightly sideways instead of a forgery committed against me specifically. "Mom," I said, "the house was worth $210,000. I don't want 1/3 of that. I want the house. Because it's mine. It was mine before any of this happened, and forging my name on a piece of paper doesn't change that." "You're being difficult," she said, and there it was again. That word, the family's favorite tool for turning a victim into the problem. "Your father made one mistake trying to help this family, and you want to punish him for it? After everything he's done for you?" I want to be honest about something here, because I think it's the moment where I truly understood what had been happening to me for 36 years. My mother wasn't lying when she said my father had done things for me. He had.
He taught me to drive.
He'd shown up at my college graduation. He loved me, in the specific, limited, conditional way he was capable of loving anyone. But somewhere in that conversation, I finally understood the difference between a family that loves you and a family that has simply been keeping a ledger, waiting for the moment they could call in the debt. "I love you," I told her. "But I'm not paying for something I didn't do, and I'm not accepting a third of the value of something that was stolen from me in full. If Dad wants to fix this, he can call the Hendersons, tell them the truth, and help me reverse the sale. That's the only fix I'm interested in." She hung up on me. It was the first time in my adult life my mother had ever hung up on me, and I sat there afterward feeling something I hadn't expected, not sadness, exactly, but a strange, cold clarity, like a fog lifting off a lake at sunrise, the kind of morning my grandmother used to wake me up early to watch. If you've ever had a boundary treated like a betrayal, you know exactly what that phone call felt like. And I want to tell you, because it matters for everything that came after, that clarity didn't feel like victory. It felt like grief. It just happened to be grief, with excellent documentation. Word travels fast in a family that size, and within a week I understood that my parents had gotten ahead of the story before I'd said a single word to anyone else. My Aunt Carol called to tell me, gently, that she understood both sides. My cousin Beth sent a long text about how money shouldn't come between family, a sentence I found almost unbearably ironic, given that money was precisely the reason my father had committed felony forgery in the first place. Even Renee, my sister in Chicago, who usually stayed out of everything, called to ask if I could just let this one go for Mom's sake, because apparently the stress of the conflict was making her knee recovery harder. Nobody asked me how I was doing. Nobody asked whether it hurt to find out your own father had practiced your signature on a notepad by the phone until it looked convincing enough to sell your inheritance. The entire extended family organized itself, almost instantly, around a single unspoken question. How do we get Simon to stop being difficult and let this go? I started keeping a folder, a physical one, then a digital backup, the kind of redundancy you learn to build when your entire career depends on documents surviving fires, floods, and human carelessness. I saved every text message. I recorded, with full disclosure at the start of the call, because Ohio requires only one-party consent, but I wanted no ambiguity about my own conduct. A conversation with my father where he said, verbatim, that he'd had Kurt notarize it without making a big deal out of it, an admission on tape that the notarization had been improperly performed. Then Patty Sorrell, the real estate agent, called me directly. I hadn't expected that. "I want you to know I had no idea," she said, and I believed her, because her voice had the particular shake of someone who suddenly understands her professional license might be in danger through no fault of her own. "Your father showed me a power of attorney. I had no reason to think it wasn't valid. It expired the day my grandmother died," I told her. "It's been void for 2 years." The silence on the other end of the phone told me she hadn't known that either, and honestly, I didn't blame her for it. Verifying the continued validity of an 11-year-old power of attorney isn't standard practice for most agents, and my father had clearly been counting on exactly that gap in due diligence. "The Hendersons are going to be devastated," she said. "They already moved half their furniture in." That detail, a retired couple's furniture, sitting in a house that had never legally been theirs to fill, was the moment the abstract legal case in my head turned into something that kept me up at night. I had done nothing wrong. I had documentation proving that fact 6 ways over. But 2 innocent people were about to lose a house they thought they'd bought fair and square, and the person responsible for that mess was my own father, sitting 40 minutes away, still telling anyone who'd listen that I was the one being unreasonable. I hired a real estate attorney the following week. Her name was Jocelyn Marsh, and she specialized in exactly this kind of dispute, fraudulent conveyance, quiet title actions, the unwinding of transactions built on documents that shouldn't have existed. I remember sitting in her office, sliding my folder across the desk and watching her go through it page by page with an expression I recognized from my own work, the particular satisfaction of a professional looking at a case that's actually going to be easy because the paper trail does all the talking. "This is about as clean as fraud cases get," she told me. "You have the original recorded deed. You have continuous tax payment records in your name. You have a witness who saw the forgery happen. And you have your father, on tape, describing an improper notarization. Simon, I don't think this is going to be a fight. I think this is going to be a formality." I should have felt relieved. I mostly did. But there was one detail I hadn't noticed yet, one that would only become clear a few weeks later, and it changed the shape of everything that came after, because it turned out my father wasn't finished. The counterattack came in stages, the way these things always do, each one slightly more desperate than the last. First, my parents held what my mother called a family meeting, to which I was, notably, not invited, but about which I heard everything within hours, because Mia, 12 years old and apparently the only person in that family with an unbroken commitment to the truth, texted me a full account. My father had told the family that I was trying to take the house away from my own mother's medical care, a framing so dishonest it took my breath away. Given that the money from the sale hadn't gone to my mother's surgery at all yet, it had gone, first and immediately, to paying off Derek's truck loan. Second, my Aunt Carol started a conversation in the family group chat suggesting that I was punishing the whole family for one mistake, and several relatives I hadn't spoken to in years chimed in with variations of the same sentiment. I want to acknowledge something honestly here. Reading those messages did make me doubt myself for a night or two. That's the part nobody tells you about family pressure. It doesn't work because the accusations are true. It works because you love these people, and some small, exhausted part of you starts to wonder if maybe keeping the peace really is worth more than being right. I called Jocelyn that week, half hoping she'd talk me out of continuing. "Tell me honestly," I said. "Am I being unreasonable?" She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something I've thought about many times since. "Simon, you're allowed to want your property back. That's not revenge. That's not punishment. That's the entire purpose of property law, to make sure the person who owns something gets to keep owning it, even when someone they love decides they'd rather not ask permission." Third, and this was the one that genuinely frightened me, my father hired a lawyer of his own, a man named Roy Petrosky, who specialized mostly in small business disputes, and Petrosky sent me a letter threatening to sue me for interference with a family financial arrangement if I didn't agree to a reasonable settlement. I remember reading that letter twice, because the phrase family financial arrangement was such an extraordinary way to describe a forged deed that I had to sit with it for a full minute before I could keep going. Jocelyn laughed when I forwarded it to her, not unkindly, but with the specific amusement of a professional watching an opponent make a mistake. "There's no such legal claim as interference with a family financial arrangement," she said. "That letter isn't a legal threat. It's a pressure tactic. He's hoping you'll be scared enough to settle before this gets in front of a judge." Fourth, and worst, my father started telling people around Millbrook, the hardware store crowd, the men he still had coffee with on Saturday mornings, people who'd known me since I was in diapers, that I'd always been jealous of Derek, and that this was really about sibling rivalry dressed up as a legal complaint. That rumor made its way back to me through an old high school friend who still lived in town, and it was the first time in this entire ordeal that I felt something closer to fury than grief. Because it wasn't just a lie about what had happened. It was a lie designed to make the people who'd known me my whole life doubt the one thing about me that had never once been in question, that I told the truth, even when it cost me something. Stay with me, because what happened next is the part of this story that still makes my chest tighten a little when I tell it. About 2 months into the dispute, right as Jocelyn was preparing the quiet title filing that would formally, legally, permanently establish my ownership in court, my mother called and asked me to come to Sunday dinner. Her voice was different, softer, tired in a way that sounded less performed than the tired voice she usually used to guilt me. "I want to apologize," she said. "Properly. In person. Your father does too. We've talked, and we understand we handled this wrong." I sat with the phone against my ear for a long moment before answering, because some small, hopeful part of me, The part that had spent 36 years believing that being useful enough might eventually earn unconditional love, wanted so badly to believe her. "I'd like that," I said. I drove to Millbrook that Sunday with something I hadn't felt in months, a kind of cautious hope, the sort you allow yourself only in very small doses, like tasting a soup you're not sure has cooled down enough yet. My mother had made my grandmother's pot roast recipe, the one from the recipe box that used to sit on the lake house counter, and for a moment, sitting at that table with the smell of rosemary and the sound of Mia laughing about something on her tablet, it almost felt like the family I used to believe I had. My father cleared his throat about halfway through dinner. "Simon," he said, "I was wrong. I should have called you instead of handling it the way I did. I'm sorry." I felt something in my chest loosen, the way it does when a weight you've been carrying so long you'd forgotten its shape finally sets down. "Thank you for saying that," I told him, and I meant it. Then he slid an envelope across the table.
"I talked to Roy," he said.
"And I think we've found something that works for everyone. We void the old deed, obviously. That's already agreed. But instead of the house going back to just you, we all sign a new agreement. The property goes into a family trust. Equal shares, you, me, your mother, Derek, Renee. You'd still control it day to day, since you're the one who actually looks after it. But this way, nobody's the only one who owns it. This way, it's finally what your grandmother should have set up in the first place. A family thing, not a Simon thing." I sat there holding that envelope and I understood, all at once, exactly what was happening. The apology hadn't been the point. The apology had been the price of admission to a conversation designed to get me to sign away, voluntarily, and with a smile, the very thing I'd spent 2 months and thousands of dollars in legal fees defending. They weren't sorry the house had been stolen from me. They were sorry the theft hadn't worked. I looked around that table, at my mother, watching me with an expression of practiced warmth that I finally, fully, recognized as strategy rather than love, at my father, who'd apologized with his mouth while his hand was already sliding a new deal across the table before the apology had even finished landing, at Derek, staring at his plate, unable to meet my eyes, because even he seemed to understand this had gone too far. Mia was the only one looking directly at me. She gave me the smallest shake of her head, so small I don't think anyone else at the table caught it. 12 years old, and she'd already learned to read a room better than half the adults in it. "I'm not signing this," I said. My mother's face crumpled instantly, all that softness gone as fast as it had arrived. "We just apologized to you," she said. "We're trying to make this right, and you're still not satisfied." "You didn't apologize to make it right," I said. "You apologized to get me to agree to something that still takes the house away from me. That's not an apology. That's a negotiation with a nicer opening line. You're choosing paperwork over your own family," my father said, and his voice had lost every trace of the softness from 10 minutes earlier. "That's who you are now. A man who cares more about a deed than his own mother's knee." I stood up from that table for the second time in 2 months. And this time, when I spoke, I didn't feel the grief I'd felt the first time. I felt something quieter and much more permanent. "I care about my mother's knee a great deal," I said. "I offered to help pay for it the very first week this happened, out of my own money, no strings, no house involved. Nobody took me up on that. Because this was never about the knee, or the truck, or even the money. This was about whether I was allowed to own something without this family finding a way to take it from me. And I finally have my answer." I left the envelope on the table and signed. I drove home in silence again, but it was a different silence than the first time, less like grief, more like the quiet that settles over a courtroom right before a verdict. The quiet title hearing happened 6 weeks later, in a courtroom that looked exactly like every other municipal courtroom I'd ever seen: fluorescent lighting, scuffed linoleum, a judge who'd clearly heard every possible version of a family fighting over property and had long since stopped being surprised by any of it. My father's lawyer tried, briefly, to argue that the original power of attorney should be interpreted as still valid in spirit, a legal argument so thin that Jocelyn didn't even bother standing up to formally object. She just looked at the judge and let the silence do the work. The judge asked, not unkindly, whether Mr. Petrosky was aware that powers of attorney terminate upon the death of the principal as a matter of black-letter law, and Petrosky, to his credit, said he'd advise his client accordingly. I testified for 11 minutes. I laid out the timeline the way I'd laid out 1,000 chains of title in my professional life, plainly, chronologically, without embellishment, because the facts, when they're true, have never once needed embellishment to be convincing. I entered the original deed, the tax records, the recorded evidence of continuous ownership, and, reluctantly, because I never wanted it to come to this, Mia's written statement, which her mother, Derek's ex-wife, had agreed to submit on her behalf, describing what she'd seen at the phone table that year. The judge ruled, from the bench, the forged deed was void. My ownership of the property was formally, permanently confirmed. The sale to the Hendersons was unwound, their money returned by the title insurance company that had improperly issued a policy without catching the broken chain of title, a company that, I later learned, terminated its relationship with the notary, Kurt Halloran, within the month, and referred the forgery to the county prosecutor for review. My father was never criminally charged. The Hendersons, understandably devastated but not interested in dragging out a legal fight against a family, declined to press further once their money was returned, and the county prosecutor, weighing the cost of pursuing an aging man with no prior record against the diminishing public interest in doing so, ultimately closed the file with a formal warning. I won't pretend that didn't complicate things for me emotionally. Part of me wanted consequences bigger than a warning letter. But I'd already gotten the only consequence that actually mattered to me, which was the truth, confirmed in writing, by a judge, in a courtroom, forever. I didn't go back to Millbrook for a long time after that. My mother called twice in the following months, both times to ask, in a roundabout way, whether I'd reconsider sharing the house, as though the court ruling had been a suggestion rather than a judgment. I told her, gently but without any give in my voice, that the house was mine, that it would stay mine, and that I loved her, but that love and ownership were two different things, and I was no longer willing to let one be used as leverage against the other. Derek and I talk sometimes now, carefully, the way you talk to someone you're not sure you trust yet but haven't given up on entirely. He apologized to me eventually on his own, without a lawyer's envelope attached to it, and I believed that apology in a way I never believed my parents, because it came with nothing attached except the words themselves. Mia is 14 now. I make a point of taking her out to the lake house every summer, just the two of us, and I let her sit on the same dock where my grandmother used to ask me what I saw. Last summer, I asked her the same question. She told me the water was greener than usual because of the algae bloom 2 docks down, and that the Petersons' old rowboat had a new coat of paint, and that somebody had left a fishing rod leaning against the boathouse that didn't belong to anyone she recognized. An examiner's eyes, just like her great-grandmother said.
I didn't tell her that.
I just told her she was right about all 3 things, and watched her smile like that mattered more than anything else I could have said. My grandmother's note still lives in that lockbox, next to the deed, next to the tax records, next to everything else that ended up proving, in the most literal legal sense possible, that I was exactly who she always said I was, the one who actually looked. I used to believe that being useful was the price of being loved in that family. I know now that isn't true, and I know it not because someone finally told me, but because I watched, in real time, what happened the moment I stopped being useful in the specific way they wanted, the moment I said no instead of yes, and I learned that the love that disappears the second you set a boundary was never really love to begin with. It was just management. A very old, very patient system for keeping me exactly where they needed me, and I'd spent 36 years mistaking the comfort of that system for the safety of belonging. The house still smells like cedar and lake water in the mornings. I still go out to the dock and watch the fog lift the way I used to with my grandmother, and some mornings when the light hits the water a certain way, I think about that dinner table, the champagne glass, the word difficult, and I feel something that isn't quite anger anymore. It's closer to gratitude, strange as that sounds. Gratitude that I happened to be the kind of person who kept the paperwork, who noticed the signature, who understood, long before anyone else at that table did, that the truth doesn't need you to defend it. It only needs you to have kept it somewhere safe, and to be willing, when the moment finally comes, to put it on the table and let it speak for itself. If you've ever been the one everyone in your family calls the difficult one simply because you finally said no, I want you to know that isn't a character flaw. Sometimes it's just the first sentence of the only chapter where you finally get to keep what's yours. Tell me in the comments if any part of this felt familiar. And if you've made it this far, you know exactly what to do. Hit subscribe because there's another story next week, and trust me, this family isn't the only one that ever tried to rewrite the truth and found out the paperwork remembered everything they didn't want it to.